Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to our panelists, to the people who have joined us here in the room, wherever you are joining us from. Welcome to this panel on lessons learned from COVID-19, opportunities to boost MSME resilience to crisis on this very last day, very last session of the WTO Public Forum 2021. My name is Barbara Ramos. I'm the Chief of Research and Strategies for Exports at the International Trade Center, which is a joint UN-WTO agency fully dedicated to strengthening the competitiveness of micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises, or MSMEs. Before we get started, a few housekeeping issues. We do have a multilingual panel today, so make sure that you click on the interpretation button and choose the language, English, French, or Spanish, as the language you would like to hear. We encourage all participants to submit questions through the platform, and we will do our best to pose them to our panelists, time allowing. And do interact with us, tweet using hashtag WTO Public Forum. So the theme of this year's Public Forum is Trade Beyond COVID-19, Building Resilience. At ITC, we learned quite a few critical lessons in this almost 2 years, and we have summarized them in our latest flagship publication, the SME Competitiveness Outlook. First, the bad. The smaller the firm, the harder it felt the impacts of the pandemic. 2 out of 3 MSMEs have reported that their business had been strongly affected by COVID-19. And this compares to less than half of large companies. But there's also the good. Despite this very bleak picture, we have observed MSMEs that were able to absorb the shock and react to the new conditions, emerging just as strong, if not stronger, than before. So today, we're going to look into the factors that allow these MSMEs not only to survive, but to thrive during COVID-19. And it is important that we dig through these lessons because these findings can inform MSMEs on actions they must take to become more competitive and resilient. But we also know that they can't do it alone. Many stakeholders have a fundamental role to play in making MSMEs more competitive. And these stakeholders include, for instance, governments, business support organizations, lead firms in value chains. So I am very pleased to have today with me on this panel, stellar panelists that represent the voices not only of MSMEs, but also of all the stakeholders. So please allow me to introduce them very briefly. Starting with His Excellency, Monsieur Dieudonné Désiré Sugouri, Ambassador and Permanent Representative of Burkina Faso to the Swiss Confederation, the United Nations Office, the WTO, and other international organizations in Geneva. He currently holds the position of coordinator of the Cotton 4 Group and of the African Group on Humanitarian Issues at the WTO. Mr. Jaime Alberto Cabal San Clemente, the President of the National Trade Federation of Colombia, FENALCO, previously Minister of Economic Development of Colombia, also served as Deputy Secretary General of the World Tourism Organization, Ambassador of Colombia to Austria and South Korea, besides multiple private sector positions. Ms. Joanna Smith, co-owner of Ok Pop Talk, based in Lao PDR, who initiated in 2002 her company's rural development program, the Village Weaver Projects, which aims to alleviate poverty in rural areas through the employment of over 400 artisans. And last but not least, Mr. David Halson, Global Head of Responsible Sourcing at Givaudan, a Swiss multinational corporation that manufactures flavors, fragrances, and active cosmetic ingredients. They employ almost 16,000 people and source from 17,000 active suppliers around the world, many of which are MSMEs in developing countries. Welcome to all of our panelists. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
So to help set the scene and initiate our discussions, we have some opening remarks from the 3 heads of the co-organizers of today's sessions: the Permanent Mission of Finland in Geneva, the Enhanced Integrated Framework, and the International Trade Center.
Excellencies, Executive Director of the International Trade Center, Mrs. Pamela Coke-Hamilton, Executive Director of the Enhanced Integrated Framework, Mr. Ratnakar Adhikari, distinguished panelists, ladies and gentlemen. Micro, small and medium-sized enterprises, MSMEs, have been hit hard and are facing great economic difficulties as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. This is critical as 9 out of 10 new jobs are created in the private sector, and the majority of them are in micro, small and medium-sized enterprises. We need to focus on finding ways to support these entrepreneurs as they are the backbone of the economy. Unfortunately, we are still living in the midst of the pandemic. But compared to the beginning of it, we have come a long way in finding ways of living in this new normal. Innovation and technology have been spurred faster than ever as we look for solutions to recover and build stronger societies. MSMEs play a role here too. Many of them have had to innovate and create new ways of doing business in order to survive. We must look forward. We can learn from the crisis and prepare for the future challenges. Today, we have a chance to discuss opportunities to build MSME resilience to future crises. Climate change, in a wider context, is the biggest challenge for our globe. What can MSMEs do today to prepare themselves for future challenges, including those provoked by climate change? As for Finland, we have set a target of becoming carbon neutral by 2035 and thereafter carbon negative. This is an ambitious goal, but we want to contribute to the global efforts. In order to help build resilience in developing countries, Finland supports the development of business-friendly, inclusive and rules-based business environment, connecting small businesses to local and global value chains, innovative work, and green and sustainable transition, to name a few sectors. To achieve these goals, ITC and EIF are our trusted partners. We build resilience together. With these words, I wish you all a very successful event. Thank you.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, allow me to first welcome all of you to this exciting session. The COVID-19 pandemic was the latest crisis that affected the world, and we are also realizing that this won't be the last. Intense weather events are happening more frequently and telling us that we need to prepare for a climate crisis, indeed, a climate emergency. This is in addition to several localized natural disasters such as earthquakes and cyclones that the less developed countries, LDCs, have already been facing. Therefore, economies around the world, but especially LDCs, need to brace themselves for upcoming crises. As we've seen with COVID-19, the potential impacts of crisis include disrupted supply chains, higher trade costs, order cancellations, loss of employment, and so on. Micro, small, and medium enterprises, MSMEs, are extremely vulnerable to these shocks, as they have limited financial resources and borrowing capacity to mitigate them. This is especially true of women-owned businesses. To survive, but also to thrive, they need support frameworks, financial mechanisms, and collaborative networks. Ever since the pandemic unfolded, the Enhanced Integrated Framework, EIF, has been working with the LDCs towards the economic resilience and recovery of their MSMEs. Recently, we launched the project entitled Gender Sensitive Climate Resilient International Market Access for LDCs through Fair Trade in Ethiopia and Timor-Leste. We will work with small-scale producers and workers in the Timorese coffee sector and Ethiopian cut flower sector, giving them tools to build robust businesses ready to face climate threats. In the Gambia, a project to support COVID-19 recovery through digitization and market access for women in horticulture is strengthening the sector by increasing coordination between actors along the value chain and creating strong cooperative supporting producers. Today's session is critical in providing small businesses with tools and strategies to remain strong in the face of upcoming crisis. This discussion is also timely because we've now learned important lessons from the pandemic on how to build resilience. I encourage you to see this session as a stepping stone on how to provide a framework for MSME to thrive and have the resources necessary to overcome any challenging times that they may face in the future. I thank you for your kind attention.
We've heard it said, don't waste a crisis. This can be a hard lesson, especially when we're still navigating one. And yet it's true. A crisis is an opportunity to reset. The pandemic has taught us global problems need global solutions. And these solutions need to focus on small firms. Not only do they make up most businesses worldwide, they have a harder time dealing with disruptions. Nearly 2 out of 3 small firms said the pandemic strongly affected operations, according to our global COVID-19 business impact survey. Less than half of large companies said the same. A year and a half into the pandemic, and that picture hasn't changed much. Small firms are still struggling, more so than larger firms, which tend to be more resilient. Data collected this summer from 2,500 businesses in Francophone Africa show that small businesses have seen their revenues fall by half and staff reduced by a third due to the pandemic. The silver lining here is that these ongoing challenges were a wake-up call. Almost half of the small businesses we interviewed are taking steps to prepare for future crises. Now, the fact that small firms are less resilient to shocks may not be surprising, but the benefits of resilience might be. Resilient companies were 5 times less likely to lay off employees during the pandemic and more likely to have stable sales, according to data in our flagship report, the SME Competitiveness Outlook. A resilient company can withstand disruption because of its strong business processes, internal and external connections, and ability to respond to changes. We found that companies that performed best during the pandemic had something in common. They had key business fundamentals in place. Examples include good inventory management, a diverse network of suppliers, and a focus on research and development, to name a few. Getting these business basics in place will put small firms on higher ground, making them more competitive in the short run and more resilient in the long run. It will also enable businesses to face the next looming crisis, climate change. World-renowned naturalist David Attenborough calls climate change the biggest threat modern humans have ever faced. So we need to act, and act quickly. For small businesses to make this shift, they can't do it alone. We'll need to communicate and coordinate on a global scale. Governments, institutions, lead firms, and international organizations must work together. To support this process, we at the International Trade Center have put together a 20-point green recovery plan outlining practical actions that these groups can take to help small firms become more competitive, resilient, and green. I look forward to working with all of you to place small businesses at the heart of the recovery, to bring about the social and economic changes we need to build a better world. Thank you.
So we heard from our heads, we need to act and act quickly. So let me turn to our panelists and see what are the lessons that would allow us to act and act fast. Let me start by getting the views of the person that lives this reality day in and day out, the owner of a small business. Let me turn to you, Ms. Smith. I'd like to ask 3 related questions. How was your company affected or still being affected by the COVID-19 pandemic? What did you do to respond? And what kind of support did you receive that was particularly helpful?
Hi, thanks for those questions. Well, yes, we've been hit hard by the pandemic, that's for sure. In Laos, the government closed the international borders in March 2019, and they're still closed today. So as a result, tourism has died, and we saw 95% of our income dry up overnight. Today, we see our team less than 50%, and salaries have been reduced between 10 and 20%. So that's how we were hit by the pandemic. And the way that we've responded is we decided that the best option, given that we had no more market, was to take our product online. So we started to focus on our web shop. And as a result of that, we created 2 initiatives to drive traffic to the website. So one was we started a podcast where we crisscrossed the globe, meeting pioneers and innovators, change makers in tourism and leaders in artisan businesses like ourselves. And we started to create a network and a series of conversations and essentially piggyback on their audience and increase our audience. So that was one initiative. A second initiative was our company lives by the ethos that you can discover Lao through textiles. So we decided to create a YouTube channel and take our whole experience of discovering Lao through textiles online. So we've created a series of videos that tell the story of Lao and its people and the processes and those handicrafts. I wish I could tell you that those innovations have been wildly successful. We've seen moderate success. And I think one of the biggest supports that we've found is actually the international network that we're a part of. So being able to discuss these problems and solutions with groups like ourselves around the world, from Peru to Afghanistan to Tibet. So I hope that answers your questions.
It does. And I'm sorry to hear that despite all these creative strategies, many companies are still struggling. So I would like to turn to the ambassador of Burkina Faso. We heard from Ms. Smith just now the fate of some of the companies in Lao PDR. How does this experience compare to the companies in Burkina Faso? And what did your government do in terms of policy and programs to support them? What are the lessons that we have learned about the kind of support that the private sector needs during crisis that would apply to other countries? Mr. Ambassador.
Merci, Madame, de me donner la parole. C'est un plaisir d'être là. Je voudrais vous dire que pendant la pandémie, plusieurs entreprises ont été éprouvées au Burkina Faso, et plus particulièrement les MPME. Celles-ci ont été considérablement affectées par la crise, entraînant la fermeture de plusieurs entreprises et par ricochet l'augmentation du nombre de chômeurs. Et le gouvernement a essayé autant que faire se peut d'apporter un soutien à ces MPME, et plusieurs actions et initiatives ont été prises par le gouvernement pour assurer la relance économique des entreprises ayant été secouées par la pandémie de la COVID-19. Parmi ces mesures, on pourrait citer notamment l'initiative pour le renforcement du capital productif des PME et PMI, dont l'objectif était d'accroître les capacités de transformation, de création d'emplois et de richesses des MPME à fort potentiel à travers la dotation de celles-ci en équipements modernes de production, au renforcement des capacités en matière d'utilisation des technologies de production et en technique managériale, la mobilisation des opérateurs nationaux autour de l'initiative pour le soutien au secteur productif. L'initiative pour le renforcement du capital productif de la filière anacarde, mise en place pour soutenir la dite filière à travers le financement de la dotation en équipement au profit des entreprises. L'initiative pour le renforcement du capital productif des entreprises évoluant dans le domaine pharmaceutique. Cette initiative par laquelle le gouvernement a apporté un soutien aux PME-PMI intervenant dans la production de médicaments et de consommables biomédicaux en vue d'accroître l'offre et de répondre aux besoins des populations dans le cadre de la lutte contre la pandémie. Et il y a le Fonds de relance économique des entreprises impactées par la COVID-19, qu'on appelle Free Covid, institué par le gouvernement suite à la crise sanitaire pour soutenir les entreprises durablement touchées par la COVID-19 d'une enveloppe globale de 100 milliards de francs CFA. Les leçons, évidemment, ont été tirées de cette expérience et le Burkina Faso dispose désormais d'un secteur privé plus tourné vers la consommation, d'où la nécessité pour le gouvernement de stimuler davantage la transformation des matières premières locales afin de limiter notre dépendance vis-à-vis d'éventuelles crises. Il y a l'accompagnement du gouvernement à l'exploitation optimale de l'énergie solaire pour combler le déficit de la demande énergétique exprimée et faire face à d'éventuelles crises, la constitution d'un fonds de réserve pour une réaction proactive afin de limiter, voire éradiquer sa prolongation. Et la crise a aussi démontré l'importance des technologies de l'information et de la communication dans les entreprises, d'où l'impérieuse nécessité pour l'État d'accompagner à l'implémentation de nouvelles technologies de l'information et de la communication dans les entreprises. Il y a également la nécessité de développer des usines pharmaceutiques et biomédicales et stimuler la collaboration entre les chercheurs et la pharmacopée traditionnelle pour la richesse des produits sanitaires, l'encouragement et l'utilisation et le développement des moyens de paiement électroniques dans les entreprises pour faciliter les transactions lors des crises du genre. Voilà un peu ce que je pourrais dire sur votre question, madame, et je vous remercie.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador. I would turn to Mr. Cabal San Clemente. We just heard from the ambassador about a few of the things that MSMEs still need in terms of government support, particularly building their technical expertise. We heard from Ms. Smith the need to connect to peers, to exchange lessons. And to all of these things, business support organizations are critical. They facilitate many of these things. So I'd like to hear from you, what did FENALCO do to provide MSMEs in Colombia with the support that they need? What are the lessons that you have learned and your organization has learned about the kind of relationships that are needed to help them survive this kind of disruption? And what more could have been done?
Buenos días, Bárbara, y a todos los panelistas. La verdad es que FENALCO, como una organización empresarial, es un facilitador y fue la voz durante esta crisis de la pandemia, no solamente de las MIPYMES, sino de todo el sector comercial en Colombia. Fue la voz y la interlocutora ante el gobierno nacional y ante los gobiernos locales de cada región de Colombia para facilitar y posibilitar el funcionamiento de las empresas. Lo hicimos de dos maneras. Uno, buscando siempre que hubiera un marco de funcionamiento de operación dentro de las restricciones y los confinamientos, que no se paralizara 100% la actividad productiva y comercial, buscando que los mandatarios locales, cuando hacían decretos de restricciones, no fueran excesivas, que esas medidas no se prolongaran durante todo el tiempo. Y permanentemente incidimos en esas decisiones. La segunda parte de cómo apoyamos a las empresas fue ante el gobierno nacional buscando medidas de alivio, de apoyo en el marco de temas económicos y de financiación, en los temas relacionados con obligaciones tributarias y finalmente con los costos laborales. En los asuntos laborales, y voy a empezar por ahí, FENALCO, llevando la voz del comercio y las MIPYMES, le propuso al gobierno el pago parcial de la nómina para que de esa manera las MIPYMES pudieran seguir funcionando, operando sin tener que hacer despidos de sus empleados. El gobierno nacional aceptó y lanzó un programa que hoy continúa vigente, va a ser prolongado incluso hasta diciembre de este año para facilitar la recuperación en este marco de reactivación de la economía colombiana. Por otra parte, también planteamos, por ejemplo, en el marco de financiación, la creación de líneas de crédito para pagar obligaciones vencidas o para pagar inclusive las nóminas de los trabajadores. Planteamos igualmente extender garantías del gobierno para que tuviera acceso MIPYMES más fácil al crédito en las líneas de financiación. Y finalmente, inclusive, FENALCO, a través de una fintech aliada, creó una propia línea de crédito para los más pequeñitos que no podían acceder a los bancos. Es decir que el trabajo fue muy importante en los alivios tributarios. Logramos que el gobierno tuviera exenciones de impuesto al consumo en restaurantes, en bares, en hoteles, igualmente exenciones de IVA, de impuesto al valor agregado para tiquetes aéreos, por ejemplo, para ayudar a recuperar el turismo. Igualmente, quitar sobretasas, las sobretasas de energía de los restaurantes. Es decir, fueron propuestas que el gobierno nacional acogió y de esa manera pudimos darle soporte a las MIPYMES. En cuanto a la segunda pregunta, es muy importante tener en cuenta que la pandemia develó que las MIPYMES tienen que estar enlazadas en un sistema. No pueden seguir actuando solas o de forma aislada, sino que el sentido de la asociatividad y participar en clústeres para enfrentar sus problemas es muy importante. Y lo otro, definitivamente la apropiación digital y tecnológica para el futuro, dado que aisladamente no pueden participar en plataformas propias, hacerlo a través de marketplaces y también hacerlo a través de plataformas globales, que es parte del apoyo que está dando FENALCO para esa inserción hacia el futuro. Yo quisiera, Bárbara, antes como estamos en nuestro Congreso Nacional de Comerciantes aquí en Cartagena con cerca de 600 empresarios, la segunda pregunta, el segundo tema lo va a abordar nuestro vicepresidente de proyectos, el doctor Luis Hernando Solar, para regresar a la presentación. Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Mr. Cabal San Clemente. I would like to close this first round on looking backwards at what we have learned from COVID with Mr. Halson. We heard from the previous speakers about restrictive measures that disrupted trade, disrupted commerce, and we know supply chains were severely affected by some of these measures. Now, in your experience as you know, working in a company that supplies from countries around the world, from suppliers around the world, what kind of risk management strategies did you have in place for MSMEs in your supply chain when COVID first hit? And what do you think worked well? What was missing? What could have been better? Let's say, in other words, you know, what have you learned in terms of planning for shocks that would be particularly helpful to MSMEs engaged in supply chains?
Thanks, Barbara. Thanks for your question. First of all, I'd like to say at Givaudan, we're sourcing many thousands of raw materials from over 100 countries. So we have a very diverse supply chain when we think about our very important supply chain of raw materials of natural origin. And the structure of this our natural supply chain means that although we engage many large global suppliers, we're also very reliant on partnering at agricultural level. And for this, we source for many MSMEs. We're fortunate enough, we've got enough scale, we're fortunate enough to have been a resilient business. And in this case, not due only to the types of product that we sell, but the way we've managed the key areas of our supply chain and the way we continue to manage and how we have managed. So in terms of ongoing risk management, for several of our key supply chains, we've got vendors or suppliers with long-term partnerships, which is crucial, and also with multi-year contracts, so looking ahead and looking into the future. And this brings both security and sustainability of supply. So security for us and also security for our upstream supply chain and our suppliers, including MSMEs, and also that sustainability of supply. And in fact, in spite of all of the challenges that we've recently experienced, the vast majority of these partners were able to operate on almost normal terms, and were even capable of supporting an increase in demand for some of these natural raw materials that we source. I think also another key to success has been to have clear and fast communication, which has certainly helped to maintain that continuity in supply chain. So, when we think about how we operate, that's really the communication, the fast and quick communication through our procurement function with those direct suppliers and also the MSMEs in the upstream supply chain. So that's been absolutely vital that we've maintained and improved that. So examples of these, the pre-crisis risk management strategies, for quite a large range of our naturals, deriving mainly from MSMEs, have included strategic stocks of our inventory, so increasing the level of inventory, so from to a region of 4 to 6 months, which is much more than we would normally have, but under the circumstances, that's certainly been pertinent to help us. And with examples being in our key supply chains such as vetiver from Haiti, patchouli from Indonesia, clovelly from Madagascar, and derivatives of that. So these stocks, and in addition, of course, to the extension of lead times, have played an amortization role to navigate through the challenges that we faced through the COVID crisis. And so I've named 3 supply chains, but that's something that's the approach we've taken. In terms of lessons learned, then I think the first one is very much strong local connections are important. So on the ground, especially in countries which have had strict and longer lockdowns. Which has then led to sort of almost an impossibility to access the country from outside. So having that internal access and the strong local connections. So Givaudan is structured in so far as we have direct resources that are on the ground in many of our key supply chains through our origination team, and that's a team within procurement which is set up to focus on maintaining and encouraging the sustainability or sustainable supply of many of our key raw materials throughout the world. So that's been a crucial role, the strength of our on-the-ground presence. And that's the results of this, being able to maintain and build on these strong local partnerships and ensure that this rapid and clear communication has paid off. Also partnering with local organizations has worked well. So in that situation, then the staff resource comes from the country in scope, even at management level. And that then ensures that we have a better continuity of the programs in crisis periods such as COVID. So there's a couple of lessons learned from the risk mitigation and the existing plans that we already had in place.
Well, thank you. As we close this first round, I think the thinking that's coming to my mind is connectivity, right? Connectivity in 2 senses. The first one, the idea of digital and ICT. We see a lot of, as we heard from Ms. Smith, some of these strategies coming out of small businesses to turn digital, both in terms of products and in terms of marketing, but also connectivity in the sense of being connected to others, whether those are their peers to exchange lessons, whether it's their federation to take their voices to their governments or to their buyers that have local presence, that have this long-term, stable, secure partnerships into their governments as well through the support that has been provided. So thank you for sharing these lessons. And I would like us now to look ahead. So thinking of the lessons that we've learned with COVID, how can we turn them into actions? What are some of the things that we can do now to prepare MSMEs for a future crisis? We know that COVID was not the first, and unfortunately will not be the last crisis or disruption that will face our economies. So how can we build some concrete actions to help MSMEs going forward. And I'll start with you, Mr. Ambassador. You mentioned the funds that the government of Burkina Faso has spent, about 5 billion CFA francs, to support businesses. And my question is, what other government regulations, incentives, financing can be put in place to best support SMEs? And how can we build a trading system that will help them through future crises, particularly the climatic one? Thank you.
Merci, merci Madame de me donner encore plus la parole. Je voudrais, pour répondre à votre question, commencer par souligner le rôle des politiques publiques et du gouvernement pour appuyer la résilience des petites entreprises lors des crises. Il faut dire que les pouvoirs publics jouent un rôle central dans l'appui à la résilience des entreprises. À cet effet, ils sont principalement chargés de mettre en place un environnement propice au développement et à la résilience des entreprises et instaurer et coordonner des mesures efficaces de soutien aux entreprises, notamment l'allègement des charges fiscales, la labellisation des produits locaux, le versement des aides aux entreprises en cas de crise et le renforcement de renforcer la capacité des entreprises. L'expérience vécue par les PME lors de la COVID-19 au Burkina Faso nous permet de tirer les conclusions qui suivent. La crise COVID-19 a permis aux entreprises de capitaliser les expériences, le développement des services de livraison, l'implémentation des nouvelles technologies de l'information et de la communication dans les échanges commerciaux, à savoir le commerce électronique, et la réadaptation par rapport au domaine d'intervention. Voilà un peu ce que je pouvais dire par rapport à votre question, madame. Je vous remercie.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. I'm going to go back to you, Mr. Hosson. What can lead firms? You talked about, some of the partnerships that you had and what you've done throughout the years to prepare for any crisis. Now, what would lead firms do today to boost the resilience of MSME suppliers in their supply chains? And I'm thinking of, we turn on the news and we see disruption in shipping, disruption in transportation. So disruption seems to be the word of the day with climate change, geopolitical crisis. So what should be the relationship between these large buyers that are often located in northern countries, their relationship with their suppliers, again, tended to be located in developing countries, how that relationship should be structured to create resilience to the suppliers and to the supply chain in general?
Thanks, Barbara. That's a great question. I just turn that off. Sorry. I think, from going back to my previous answer in terms of some of the mitigation that we put in, I think continually sitting on buffer stock of extra inventory, for instance, to get over these supply chain events isn't a long-term solution, because all businesses would see that much of the value of supply chains is to be efficient and slick in operation, to make the most use of the resource and the capital tied up in that. But the crisis has reinforced the need to have a continuity plan in place, which can be switched on quickly. So that's been vital. So the speed of response. And in order to get to this point, lead firms, such as Givaudan, we have a responsibility to maintain those close communication with our supply chain partners. So that connectivity you were mentioning just now, and certainly with the MSMEs in scope, and to ensure that regular dialogue is maintained on subjects, pertinent to the supply chain, such as volume demand, forecasting, and more accurate forecasting, and customer trend evolution. These are specific activities or specific topics that are relating to being able to try and anticipate as opposed to just solely reacting. And we're also on an IT development journey, us and a lot of other businesses, in working towards a more digital transparency between supply chain partners. So that will also help to improve our ability to anticipate supply chain events. This sort of digital roadmap that we're on, is going to be hypercritical on how we improve and how we look ahead and how we're able to share the data between the different partners and the different actors in the supply chain. And also taking our role in the climate change mitigation, doing our bit in that is also super important. And that's why we're implementing a plan to ensure that we're climate positive by 2050. So it sounds a long way away, but there's so much to do, and that's just around the corner. And of course, that includes then impacting and reducing the impacts on our upstream supply chain. And we're not alone in this challenge, and this is another area. So, better collaboration. For instance, within the fragrance and flavor industry, which is where we sit, via the implementation, for instance, of the IFRA and IOFI Sustainability Charter. So IFRA is the International Fragrance Association, and IOFI is the International Organization for the Flavor Industry. So this is a collaboration within industry. This can also play a vital role as a way of ensuring a more sustainable and resilient supply chain between the industry and then those supply chain partners in the South that you talk about. So, we're all on this journey together. We all should be pointing in the same direction. This should be a pre-competitive space in terms of encouraging the sustainability of our collective supply chains. So this collaboration and serious collaboration will allow us to accelerate and certainly support better the MSMEs within that supply chain. And in addition, Givaudan has a foundation. So we have a Givaudan Foundation through which we've got around 50 different projects in countries where we buy our raw materials, which also contributes to the strengthening the relationship within those supplying MSMEs. And so in this sort of context, then this relationship goes beyond the transactional and invites both entities to understand better the local suppliers, including obviously the producing communities. And so the more geopolitical, social and environmental parameters are taken into account during that project design and need assessment phase. And the most relevant will be the activities funded through that foundation and implemented with various local partners, the supplying MSMEs being one of those partners. So hopefully that goes some way to answer the question and the challenge that we have. Thanks.
Thank you again for this very concrete examples. I'll turn to Fenalco again. Oh, I guess we have a replacement for Mr. Jaime. So would you like to introduce yourself?
Bárbara, muy buenos días, un gusto, muy buenos días en Colombia, muy buenas tardes en el mundo. Mi nombre es Luis Hernando Solarte, soy el vicepresidente de proyectos y un cordial saludo y atento a la pregunta que nos formules para poder aportar al desarrollo del panel.
Well, welcome, Luis Fernando. I do have a question for you. And in his intervention before you joined us, Senor Jaime, he mentioned a few financial and fiscal measures that Fenalco intermediated in Colombia to help MSMEs cope. So my question to you, understanding that lack of finance and knowledge sometimes often prevent small firms from investing in the kinds of measures that will make them more resilient. What can business support organizations or federations such as Fenalco can do to help MSMEs access finance, access funds, access the resources, both in terms of capital as well as in terms of expertise, to become more resilient to future shocks? Thank you.
Como bien lo señalas en tu pregunta, el acceso, las pequeñas y medianas empresas al sistema financiero es muy limitado. Entonces, lo que organizaciones como las nuestras hacen es, por ejemplo, articularse con financieras tecnológicas, que son estructuras que están más diseñadas por su metodología de crédito para llegar a esos pequeños empresarios que están irrigados en todo el país y que no son los que normalmente son sujetos de crédito por las grandes corporaciones financieras. En este sentido, lo que nosotros hacemos es articularnos con el gobierno para que el gobierno nos provea esas garantías que pueden ir hasta un 90% del crédito que requieren las pequeños empresarios, y de esta manera, pues ellos obtienen esos avales crediticios que les suministra el gobierno. Nosotros participamos con la banca privada fondeando el producto financiero que trabajamos con las financieras tecnológicas, y de esta manera hemos logrado llegar productos de crédito en los pequeños negocios. El otro punto importante, Bárbara, es aprender a conocer cada uno de los sectores. No son los mismos productos financieros los que se necesitan los pequeños empresarios del agro, que los pequeños empresarios del comercio, que los pequeños empresarios del sector de la construcción. En ese sentido, hemos aprendido a diseñar productos especializados de acuerdo a las necesidades y al funcionamiento del negocio. Entonces, yo creo que eso es lo que nuestra organización ha venido adelantando de la mano del gobierno, y lo que hacia futuro queremos hacer es también empezar a encontrar esas estructuras que están por fuera del crédito, como los fondos de capital de riesgo, los fondos de capital privado, que hoy están buscando en países como los nuestros esos proyectos importantes de innovación, que seguramente con las oportunidades que en determinados sectores ha traído la pandemia, particularmente en nuestro sector, en el comercio electrónico, lograremos hacer ese match entre ese capital que busca inversiones importantes con retornos altos en negocios digitales y los emprendimientos que nosotros hemos logrado identificar para aprovechar todo lo que está generando el comercio electrónico.
Thank you, Luis Fernando, for your insights, and particularly the one size fits all is not what's going to take us there, right? We need to understand the specific needs of different subsectors or different types of small businesses. So let me conclude the second round with Ms. Smith again. Having heard from governments, lead firms, supporting organizations, what are your takeaways? What are the 3 steps that you think small businesses should take to prepare for next crisis? And what kind of help is essential for them to be able to succeed?
Hi, Barbara again.
Yeah.
So, I mean, these recommendations are really based on lessons learned over the last 18 months. And I'll list my 3 quickly, and then I'll just talk you through them. So the first one would be to diversify your target market. And the second one would be to have access to a public-private dialogue. And the third one would be, where possible, try to create a multi-skilled workforce. And so just thinking about the first one, about diversifying your target market, this is all about not having all your eggs in one basket like we did, focusing primarily on the tourism market. And so, like with all challenges come opportunities, and now's been a great time for us in the last 18 months to really diversify all the different revenue streams, and look for more markets. So that's the first advice. And the second is, you know, we're constantly trying to plan for the future. When will Lao reopen? And what protocols in place, tourism protocols in place will the government have, and that kind of thing. And we're just sort of talking amongst ourselves, because currently we don't have a platform for discussion with the government. We have quite a weak Chamber of Commerce. And so one of the outcomes that we're working on at the moment is to create a platform for discussion with the government, and maybe even help them contribute to their plans moving forward. And then the third one is really about the fact that we we've really, you know, we're based in one of these least developed countries, and we have quite limited human resources here, and we've really focused on training individuals with one skill. And I think now, you know, an opportunity has arisen here to create a multi-skilled task force. And I actually think this is an area that we're going to need the most help with. And so if there are development agencies that are focusing on capacity building, then I would say, let's do it.
Thank you, Ms. Smith. We have a few minutes before we close the session today. So I propose that we do a quick fire round with all of our panelists, that you give me your 1 or 2 key takeaways on how we can reinforce the resilience of MSMEs. And Mr. Hosson, may I start with you, please? 1 or 2 takeaways on how can we reinforce the resilience of MSMEs?
Thanks, Barbara. Yeah, so I'll keep it very succinct and brief, and sort of with our 1 key takeaway. You know, nobody wants to see a repeat of the disruption that we've seen through the COVID pandemic. But as you said, more crises will probably be in future with you know, the climate crisis. But you know, for events like this to be, you know, we don't want them to be a regular occurrence. However, we need to be mindful of that. So one positive outcome, I think, has been a reinforcement of the need to have close and regular dialogue between supply chain partners. You know, an ongoing focus on resilience. So, you know, to be more proactive and be more anticipatory rather than purely reactively. So I think, you know, that's the 1 key takeaway, is to ensure or to reinforce the quality and the value in that close dialogue between supply chain partners.
Thank you. I'd like to turn to Fenalco. I don't know which one of our panelists is there. If it's Señor Cabal San Clemente or Luis Fernando. Luis Fernando, what is your 1 or 2 key takeaway for us to build the resilience of MSMEs?
Yo creo que la experiencia que nos da esta pandemia en Latinoamérica, a partir de un estudio que realizó la Corporación Andina de Fomento, es que aquellos países que tenían una infraestructura tecnológica mayormente desarrollada han sabido superar la crisis con mayores posibilidades. Entonces, la herramienta, la estrategia y lo que debemos implementar hacia adelante es, desde un lado, propiciar y ayudar a que las MIPYMES tengan esas posibilidades de digitalizar sus procesos. Y de otro lado, que los gobiernos tengan la infraestructura tecnológica necesaria para que para que estas empresas, especialmente las pequeñas y medianas, puedan ingresar a todos estos temas del comercio electrónico, a todos estos temas de las redes digitales, a todas las cadenas de valor que hoy están a nivel mundial. Y de esa manera, creo que ese es el camino que nosotros visualizamos para hacerlas más resilientes, no solo como empresas, sino también como país.
Thank you, Luis Fernando. I will turn now to Ms. Smith again for your key takeaways.
You know, I've been thinking a lot about the last question. Sorry, I'm not quite sure what happened there. The last question, and I wanted to add that I think, you know, the innate characteristic of an entrepreneur is that they are eternal optimists. And I would say that even though we're in very challenging times, to stay true to your optimistic self and keep looking for the opportunities in the crisis. You know, there's so many good lessons learned, and I think that we're going to come out of this stronger than ever. And so that's my key takeaway.
Apologies. I will finish this last round with the Ambassador of Burkina Faso on his key takeaways on reinforcing the resilience of MSMEs.
Merci, madame. Vous m'entendez? Je sens un écho. OK. Merci, madame. Je crois que la crise de la COVID-19 que nous souhaitons voir partir très rapidement a créé beaucoup de difficultés pour les MPME. Et je crois que les pouvoirs publics ont joué un rôle important dans le fonctionnement des MPME et beaucoup de leçons ont été apprises. Et je crois que la communauté internationale est assez bien rodée pour pouvoir faire face à des crises futures. Donc, je crois que l'accompagnement des gouvernements aux PME durant des crises comme celle de la COVID-19 devait être renforcé à travers un certain nombre de mesures comme des soutiens aux entreprises pour pouvoir relancer leurs activités, l'allègement des charges fiscales et toute autre mesure pour permettre aux entreprises de pouvoir fonctionner normalement. Et je crois que les pouvoirs publics ont un rôle central à ce niveau-là et nous devons travailler à pouvoir accompagner les MPM pour faire face à ces genres de crises. Merci, madame.
Well, we're coming to the end of our session. I would like to thank all of our panelists today. This was a very enlightening discussion. I learned a lot. And if I may, I would like just to give you all a 2-minute reflection on some of the things that I heard today. And for me, my takeaway is that we do need long-term planning. I will borrow from Mr. Hassan, who says that we need to anticipate instead of reacting. And it's true, long-term planning is essential for us to avoid the kind of damage that we have observed with COVID. And for that, we know the recipe. It's creating a supportive business environment where our companies can diversify and have access to markets and have the right support for them to thrive. We need to invest in the right set of skills, either at the firm level by hiring employees and workers with the right education, but also at a higher level, investing in education so those workers are available to the firms. It's even more so investing in innovation. And that a big part of that now is about digital. We heard about the importance of going digital for marketing, for production, as well as on e-commerce. So it's important that we focus on the long term, but let's not just stay with the long term. Let's not just look at 2030 or 2050 as the years in which we're going to accomplish something. MSMEs are struggling now. They need help now. Change is happening. Climate change is happening now. And we need to act. As ITC Executive Director said in the beginning in her opening remarks, we need to act and we need to act now. And for that, even though I borrow the optimism of Ms. Smith, we should not let a good crisis go to waste. What I learned here today is that we need all the stakeholders represented in this panel, governments, business support organizations, enterprises, lead firms, to act together, to coordinate, to support the MSMEs that are the backbone of our economies and societies. And with that, I would like to thank my co-organizers, the EIF, the Permanent Mission of Finland, the tireless team that has worked to make this possible, Sarah, Marie-France, Susanna, especially, that have worked for the past few weeks to make this possible, and obviously our distinguished panelists who joined me today from very far away. Thank you so much for joining me, and I hope to see you in person next year in this public forum. Have a good evening.
Thanks, Barbara. Thanks, everyone.